Hello, I'm Doug.
Hello, I'm Ruth.
Pleased to meet you.
Pleased to meet you too.
Ruth, could you tell me when you were born and where you were born, please, and why you've come to talk to us today?
I was born in Berlin in 1935, and as I came to England on the Kindertransport, that's an interesting story that I'm happy to tell you about today.
I believe you've written a book. Could you tell me about the book that you've written, please?
I brought a copy with me. I've written this book because I go into a lot of schools to tell my story, to help people understand the meaning of the Holocaust on people's actual lives. And this is my story in more detail, especially written to attract school students, particularly the less academic ones, because I've written interesting stories about animals on the farm, which was my third foster family. And farms are just not like that today. They've become industrialized, computerized, massive things, and the way of life during the war has gone. I've chosen the title for this book, Person of No Nationality, because the Nazis took away nationality, German nationality, from all the Jews in 1935, when I was only a few months old. So I had no nationality for 18 years until I could become British at 18. And when I needed to travel after the war, I couldn't get a passport, because you can't get a passport without nationality, and I had to have a document, a piece of paper that had a person of no nationality written across the top. And that made me feel pretty awful and destroyed my self-confidence completely. And it took a long time to regain my self-confidence.
Ruth, can you tell me a bit about your life in Germany before the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, please?
I was born in 1935 in Berlin. Already things were getting pretty bad because the Nazis came to power in 1933. My parents, my family, we were an ordinary German family. My father was a lawyer, my mother was his secretary. He married his secretary, something that happens all the time. My father was an only child. His father died, I think, just before he was born. I didn't know either of my grandfathers. They were already dead before I was born. But I knew my two grandmothers very well. My father's mother was not very well, and I can remember visiting her in hospital. My mother's mother and my aunt lived together, and I spent a lot of time with them because they were a Christian family, and it was relatively safe from the Nazis to be with them, whereas my father was Jewish, and the Nazis were determined to make life very difficult for all the Jewish families, and they sacked my father. All the professionals who were Jewish were given the sack. My mother was able to get another job because she was Aryan German, not Jewish. But things got worse and worse. Our nanny cum companion was not Jewish and wasn't allowed to work for us, be with us even anymore. And there were restrictions about where Jews were able to go. Public places were banned to Jews. They weren't allowed to own a car or a bicycle or even a pet. So that it was very difficult for Jewish families to keep going, and many of them left the country earlier. But then the crunch really came on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, where every city right across Germany and Austria on the same night, November the 9th, 1938, the Nazis planned to get the crowds rioting, smashing up Jewish property, which they knew which was Jewish property because it had all been painted by the Nazis with the word Judah, meaning Jew, or the Star of David. They set the synagogues on fire, and whilst the crowds were rioting, the secret police, the SS, went into all the Jewish homes. They had their list, they knew where they were, and they arrested all the men. My dad would have been arrested that night, but he took my 7-year-old brother by the hand, and they walked on the edge of the crowd that night, which was the safest place to be because nobody would imagine you were Jewish if you were in that anti-Jewish rioting crowd. But it had a very shocking effect on my brother. In fact, he had wiped it out of his mind, and he had no recollection of it until a few years ago. An interviewer like you wanted to hear his story, and if you know that somebody really wants to know your story, you start remembering things that you just haven't been able to talk about because you didn't feel safe enough that people wouldn't ridicule you.
Ruth, what was your brother's name?
Martin. He was 3 years older than me, and I adored him. He was my big brother. And that was terribly important when we were 10 years without our parents. We had each other. And he mothered me, literally. And I was also important to him because I was the one link to the past for him, because our parents' last words to him were, "Look after your little sister."
It must have been really difficult for the Jews living in Germany at that point. How did you get out of Germany?
Well, I wasn't aware. I was pretty well sheltered. I didn't know about Kristallnacht until afterwards, long after the war. But that had such an effect that the British government said, you can rescue the children, but no adults. And trains were organised to take the children to England. They each had to be sponsored. Martin and I were sponsored by the Quakers, that I do know. And I remember the journey over very well. That's how we came to England, because after Kristallnacht, the British government relented and say you can rescue the children. But it was very hard on families who had to decide whether they would send their children on these trains, knowing that they might never see them again. And 10,000 children were brought to England, and just over half never saw either of their parents again.
Right. Can you tell us about the journey across to Britain with the kinder transport, please, Ruth?
I can remember bits of it very clearly. I wouldn't have known what it was all about at age 4, but I do remember long train journey. I thought it was a family outing because my mother came with us. She was able to, as a German citizen, she was able to get a holiday visa to go on the kinder transport with us, but of course she had to come back. I remember asking, are we nearly there, are we nearly there? It seemed endless, and then I was woken out of a deep sleep when we got to the coast, and more or less dragged through to the boat. And I remember being very frightened at this huge boat, but so many people piling on and so many suitcases. I was convinced it was going to sink. And I said to my brother, the boat's going to sink, and he said, oh, don't be so silly, boats don't sink. But I think I probably knew that boats do sink in your bath if you put too much on them.
Yeah.
But because my brother said it was all right, it was all right. Then I was dreadfully sick in the crossing. I woke up and was sick all over the place. And then train journey went on, even though we were in England, because we first went from Harwich down to London, Liverpool Street Station, where all the sorting out was done, and then we had another train journey to Kent to our first foster family.
Ruth, who were your first foster family then?
The first foster family that our mother brought us to were a vicar and his wife, the Steads in Kent. That was in February 1939. We were with them for 2 years, and then we were sent to a Quaker boarding school. Now, his wife was very much younger than him. He was a kindly old gentleman. She was much younger and had no children of her own, and she really didn't want to look after us. And she was very cruel to us. We were very unhappy there. But after 2 years, when we went to the Quaker boarding school, that was wonderful. It was a wonderful school. We were very happy there. But we were only there for 2 years. We had to go back for the holidays to the States. But after 2 years at that lovely school, the Reverend Stead died. I think he was already ill. And of course she didn't want us back, which we were very relieved about. And we spent a few months in a hostel for displaced children in London until they found us a second foster family, which were very different. They had 5 children of their own, also in Kent, but they took in 2 more children, and we were very happy there. That was a lovely family to be with. But we were only 2 years there because it was in the path of the doodlebugs. These doodlebugs were catapulted from the Belgian coast with just enough fuel to reach London. They were little planes with wings but no pilot, and they would drop us a gigantic bomb and do a lot of damage in London. So they put guns all around where we were living to try and shoot them down. Now, that was all very exciting, but it was scary as well. And my brother got very, very disturbed and distraught and had to be moved. And they found another family for him out of the path of the doodlebugs in Sussex, which was a farm. And they were another wonderful family, and they weren't prepared to take 1 of 2 children, because they thought they shouldn't be separated. So I had to go along as well, which was another upheaval, but I settled down very quickly because I loved the animals on the farm.
What was it like for you in England, Ruth, when you came there? Because you obviously had no English.
I didn't know any English. My brother Martin was taught a little bit of English before we came over, and I always wondered why I wasn't. I'm sure I could have learnt some at 4. But we were forbidden to speak German, and that is how you learn a language very quickly if you're not allowed to speak anything else. We were also given elocution lessons, which makes you pronounce perfectly so that you don't have an accent. And that was pretty important because when we went to school, the Quaker boarding school first of all, we had no accent, so we were just like all the other kids, and nobody knew that we were Jewish or that we'd come from Germany. Until one school later on, we were on the farm by then, and the school I went to, some of the younger kids found out that I'd come from Germany, and they started doing Heil Hitler salutes and calling me a Nazi. And I protected myself by saying, I can't be a Nazi, I'm not even German, because the Germans kicked me out for not being German. I'm Jewish. And there was virtually no anti-Semitism in the country, at least where we grew up. There wasn't. It was rife in the cities in England. My husband, who is a Jew who was born in London, came in for a lot of anti-Semitism in his childhood. But I didn't.
Back in Germany, what happened to your father?
My father stayed on. I worked out long after the end of the war that he really didn't want to leave his mother, who was very ill in hospital. And she died in May 1939, May 1939. And he must have left just after she died, because he came to visit us in England before he got a boat from Southampton to Shanghai. Shanghai was one of the last places that would accept Jews at all at that time. I think South America was the only other place. And he went on a long sea trip right round Africa, through the Indian Ocean, up to Shanghai, the other side of the world, literally. And it must have taken him a good 6 weeks to get there. It was pretty awful conditions in Shanghai. It was an international community, but there was already a war between Japan and China, so he escaped the war in Europe only to come straight into another war, and things were pretty grim there, but he did survive. He was able to teach himself British law, pass exams, and then he got a job in Shanghai practicing British law. So he did fairly well then, and he was eight years there altogether. It took another 2 years after the end of the war before he could get a boat back to Europe.
Did your mother try to get to see your father in Shanghai?
After war broke out, of course she wouldn't be able to. I think my father was on the last ship that was allowed to dock in Shanghai. Now, I do know from books that have been written, and I've heard people speak about it who were in Shanghai, some whole families did manage to get there. Why my parents chose not to go with the whole family, I don't know. I think having got Martin and me out on the kinder transport, my mother didn't want to leave Europe. But I don't actually know. We weren't able to talk about it.
In 1942, the Japanese invaded all that area of China, including Shanghai. What happened to your father then?
Yes, things did get very difficult then, because there was a German colony in Shanghai, and they were Nazis, and they tried to get the Japanese to herd all the Jewish refugees onto a boat and sink it in the Wangpo River. But the Japanese, because they were ordered to do that, decided not to do it. And what they actually did was to relocate all the Jewish refugees to a sort of ghetto. They chose the most overcrowded, slummiest part of Shanghai, and they made all the Jews relocate there. And they were able to survive there, but it must have been pretty grim for them.
What happened to your mother after she left you in England?
My mother, of course, had to go back to Germany. She only had a holiday visa. She was a German citizen. She couldn't stay in England. Now, neither my brother nor myself, neither of us could remember her leaving. I don't know whether she sneaked out when we were asleep, or whether it was so painful that we both blocked it out of our minds. I simply don't know. She went back to Berlin because, of course, my father was still there, and after he had gone to Shanghai, I don't know what she did, but I do know that later she took part in a protest march when the Nazis ordered all the Aryan Germans who were married to Jews to divorce them. She refused to divorce my father and took part in the protest march. They were all arrested, but they couldn't be kept. They had to be released. And after that, she went into hiding. Now, she ended the war right down the south, near the Swiss border. And she said that she wanted to escape through Switzerland, but she never actually did. So she didn't talk about it after the war, so I really have no idea what happened to her in the 10 years that we never saw her, because it was impossible to talk about it.
Were any of your family killed during the Holocaust?
Well, I didn't really know the wider family because I was only 4 when I left Germany, but I do know that my great-aunt and her husband were murdered in a concentration camp. I probably met them, but I have no recall of them. I know that some more distant relatives fled to America, but I really don't know because I never had a family tree, so I don't know. Sad thing is I don't know who my family were. I've pieced together my mother's family. I know a bit more about them. She had a brother and sister in Berlin who survived being bombed out 3 times in Berlin.
What happened to families like yours that were Jewish in Germany during the Holocaust?
Well, in my view, the Holocaust began in 1938 with the Avian Conference in France in the spring. 32 countries met to talk about the problem of how Germany was treating the Jews. And only one country, little Dominican Republic, was willing to take in Jews. All the other countries, including America, Britain, Australia, all said that they couldn't possibly take in Jews. And I think that gave the Nazis the green light to go ahead. And at that point, they realized that nobody was going to notice, and they clamped down harder. And I think that is why Kristallnacht went ahead after the Avian Conference. And then when the world did not react to that enormous attack on the Jews, then they started to plan to kill them. And they set up a horrific, industrialized, meticulously planned system to annihilate the Jews, and they managed to murder 6 million Jews. But it wasn't only Jews. As well as the 6 million Jews, they murdered 500,000 gypsies and a lot of political opponents, homosexuals, various other people that the Nazis perceived as a threat. They just annihilated them. A really horrific period in history, in European history, which tended to get attributed to the Germans. But in my opinion, every other country in Europe and the wider world contributed by not preventing it, not doing something about it. That was appeasement then. And appeasement with murderous dictators like Hitler simply makes them greedier and encourages them to go on.
There were two types of concentration camp, weren't there?
There were lots of different concentration camps, mainly in the east, mainly in Poland, but some in Germany. There were several hundred concentration camps altogether. Some of them were collecting camps where Jewish families were herded into them, waiting to be transported to the east, where there were 6 camps that were built specifically to kill rather than anything else. But all the other camps were mainly work camps because the Nazis wanted to get every last ounce out of the Jews of work before they starved them to death or murdered them in the gas chambers and burnt their bodies in the crematoria.
I know this might be a bit painful, but could you explain to us how they got rid of the Jews in these killing camps, please?
Well, it really started with the euthanasia program, where the Germans, the Nazis wanted to create a master race, and anybody with a disability, a mental or physical disability, had to be got rid of because they would spoil the purity of the master race. And so they killed off, they organised 6 killing stations where they transported from hospitals and homes all the children who had defects, first of all, and later adults, and they systematically killed them with carbon dioxide gas, which is a horrible slow death. And they burnt the bodies in crematoria, and when the local population complained of the smell, not of what was going on, but of the smell, they stopped the crematoria and went on killing, but put them in huge pits with lime or something like that. And those killing stations were where the future commandants of the concentration camps learnt their trade. And in the concentration camps, well, first of all, they started the killing on the Eastern Front, killing Jews. They called all the Jews partisans as their excuse for killing them. And they started off by shooting them en masse, lining them up, making them dig their own graves, and then lining them up and shooting them to fall into the pits, and then putting lime on them. But that was a very painful, slow process, and they found that the soldiers doing the killing couldn't cope with it. It was a really horrible story. That is when they started experimenting, first of all, with lorries where they fed the exhaust into the lorry full of Jews to kill them. And then they developed a special gas called Cyclone B, and that they then used in huge rooms that were falsely decked out as showers, so that the Jews were made to undress and go into what they were told were showers, and then when they were shut in, the gas would be fed into it, and afterwards the dead bodies were then burnt in crematoria.
What was it like for your husband as a Jew in London, perhaps before the war?
My husband was born in London and grew up in London. He was evacuated actually to Luton for a little while, but came back to London. Londoners can't stay away from London. Now, he came in for a lot of anti-Semitism. It was very prevalent in London and other cities at the time, because there was quite a strong fascist movement in Britain that agreed with Hitler and supported him.
Ruth, what happened to you at the end of the war?
Well, the war actually ended just after we came to the farm, but nothing changed because it took a long time to get anything like back to normal. And 4 years actually went after the war before we heard anything from our mother. We knew about our father in Shanghai because we got occasional letters through the Red Cross, but we had no contact for 10 years from our mother. And then suddenly she came over to England and wanted to take me back to Germany. I had been brainwashed with British propaganda for 10 years about what a terrible place Germany was, so I was very, very upset, and I couldn't contemplate going to Germany, and my foster parents said, "You're part of the family, we love you," and my mother went back to Germany on her own, which was terrible, being so rejected by her daughter. But when she got back, my father, who was a lawyer and had a job by then in Mainz, not in Berlin, but in Mainz, he served a court order on my foster parents, and my foster mother, who'd said I was one of the family, had to take me to Germany and leave me there, which really was the last straw. My life had been turned upside down too many times. I simply couldn't adjust. And I was 14, not a sweet little 4-year-old desperate to please. And I became very confused, disoriented, angry. My parents could see that it wasn't going to work, and they let me come back to England, back to the farm, back to my school, but nothing was the same. I'd lost my trust in human beings completely. I felt so betrayed. It was really a worse experience than the Kindertransport to go back to Germany. Again, overnight, everything familiar, my home, language, family, everything was gone, and it was like being in a world gone mad, literally. But I came back to the farm and I could trust the animals. I could get comfort from the animals, and that way I survived and finished my education in England. But although I visited my parents for school holidays and then university holidays and went on visiting them 2 or 3 times a year, there was no way I was going to go back to Germany. Particularly after I met my husband at university.
Yeah. Ruth, why do you think it is important to learn about the Holocaust?
Well, I think it's very important, although it's very, very difficult. We need to face the horrors of the past in order to be in control of the present and the future. As the philosopher Santayana said, those who can't remember are doomed to repeat. And sadly, because we've been so reluctant to think about, know about and face the horrors that have been perpetrated, instead of never again, it's actually been again and again. There have been atrocities and genocides many times over after the end of the Holocaust. And I think it's going to go on until we bear to, however horrible it is, to learn about and see films and read books and hear people talking about it, we still have to face it. Otherwise, when it's denied, the fascists and brutal people will have the impunity to do it again and again.
Ruth, thank you so much for coming to talk to us this morning. You know, I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to come and talk about it because I think it's so important. I welcome any chance to tell my story in the hope that it will make people want to find out more stories and learn more about it.
Cool.